My name is Charlie Peters. I'm a journalist and documentary filmmaker with GB News, and I'm investigating the national grooming gang scandal. We've seen what happened in Rotherham, where over 1,500 girls were sexually exploited. I want to know why the police looked the other way, despite years of evidence.
I couldn't get any answers. All I was told was that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute.
I was raped over 1,000 times and I don't even know how many men assaulted me. It's impossible to recall. It was just so constant.
To understand why they failed so badly, I'm going to Manchester, where in Rochdale, a similar scandal took place. I'm meeting with the only whistleblower to resign from the police over the grooming gang's cover-up.
Well, in 2004, I was approached and asked to join, to go on board with a job that became known as Operation Augusta. And this was we had a little girl who had died in Rochdale, who had been groomed, sexually abused. I was asked to go on an investigation to look at whether we had a problem in Greater Manchester with young white children being groomed and sexually abused by gangs of Pakistani men.
Greater Manchester did have a problem with grooming gangs. The little girl who died, Victoria Agoglia, was 15 years old when in 2003 she was groomed by a rape gang and then killed by a heroin overdose given to her by an abuser.
We had dozens of young, very vulnerable children who were mainly they were all living in care, who were being systematically groomed and raped by gangs of Pakistani men.
Over 18 months, Maggie and her team compiled a compelling case against the gangs they knew were operating in Rochdale. But she had to take a break from the investigation when her husband fell terminally ill.
And at that point, we had 100 paedophiles on a database that we knew were raping children. We had about 3 dozen children that we had identified as being abused. So that job was a full singing and dancing major investigation. You know, my job was done and I went off work content and happy to know that those men were going to be prosecuted.
But when Maggie returned from compassionate leave after the death of her husband, she found that Operation Augusta had been closed down. None of the abusers were convicted.
I couldn't get any answers. All I was told was that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. And I knew, because I had been working on that job from day one, I knew we had the evidence.
The last information placed on the police database for the operation was on the 6th of July 2005, one day before the 7/7 terror attacks in London.
There was a gold level meeting within GMP, and that means the most senior officers in GMP, that they had a meeting and that the decision was made at that meeting that they were not prepared to put resources into that investigation.
Was it shut down because revealing the grooming gangs just after an Islamist attack was considered too incendiary? We'll never know, because those minutes were conveniently lost. Years later, Maggie was brought back in for a new operation to tackle the gangs.
I was reapproached in 2010 and asked to go on board a case in Rochdale, which became known as Operation Span.
Maggie was asked to join the team to gain the trust of a young girl called Ruby, who, aged just 12, had been raped by known paedophile Adil Khan.
When she was just 13, she had been made pregnant by that man. And the police at the time, which had been 2 years previous to that, had seized a fetus.
But despite having the frozen fetus and the DNA needed to prove the identity of Ruby's rapist, Adil Khan was not charged with rape.
Ruby, we had a fetus. We knew who had made her pregnant, but the authorities failed to protect her. The schools knew, social services knew, the police knew. And even though we all knew, even though we had DNA, even though we knew who was responsible, that man was still never charged with rape.
Ruby's suffering extended to her family. She had a sister, Amber, who had also become a victim of the rape gangs.
Amber had been arrested as a child of 15 on suspicion of being a madam. I was asked to gain her trust and ask her to tell us what had happened, to identify the abusers, to tell us of the locations, the phone numbers.
One of those locations was an address in Fallinge, where there was a house with a list on the back of the door, with about 20 names on it. Abusers could take girls there, pass them around to be raped by multiple men, and then leave a tick by their names to show that they'd used the rape house. At the end of the week or month, they'd pay their bill for using it. It was like a paedophile honesty box. Despite the scale of the crimes, the trial was limited and just 9 men were convicted. The lead defendant said he objected to being tried by an all-white jury. The same man had once forced a 15-year-old girl to have sex with his nephew as a birthday present.
By 2017, all but 2 of the 9 were out of prison, having been released halfway through their sentences. 4 of them had also been granted millions of pounds in legal aid to fight deportation.
Their victims have to live with their abusers, walking around as free men. They see them in the street. They see them at work. They see them in the supermarket.
Both Rotherham and Rochdale are similar in culture and history, former industrial towns in the north of England. But this national scandal scarred towns and cities of all descriptions across the country.
My investigation took me to Telford, a new town in leafy Shropshire, near the Welsh border, where another child sexual exploitation scandal had emerged. It's here that an inquiry in 2022 found that 1,000 girls had been abused by the gangs since the 1980s. Much of the worst abuse happened in the suburb of Wellington. Children were sold for sex in a rape den. Some council workers reacted by saying that child prostitution had always happened. The gangs here often threatened their victims with the memory of Lucy Lowe, who, aged just 15, was burnt to death with her mother, sister, and unborn child by her abuser. To find out why Telford Council had also failed to act, I spoke to Samantha Smith, a child abuse victim from the town.
I remember when I was 16, my social worker told me that if you were physically abused, why were there no bruises? And that perfectly sums up how I was treated by those in positions of power.
The ignorance and victim blaming that Samantha was subjected to from Telford social workers was eerily similar to the culture exposed by the Casey report into Rotherham Borough Council.
The culture was exactly the same. It was the idea that girls like me were somehow responsible for the abuse we suffered.
The council here didn't just turn a blind eye, it was incompetent. Teams failed to share information, staffing issues meant that there were never enough people to do the work, and the council tried to close down a child abuse unit, citing austerity. But political correctness played a role here too. When teachers confessed that there was a problem in this authority with Pakistani youths abusing girls, they were accused of being racist by a council worker. Detailed reports weren't shared over fears that they could start a race riot. I spoke to another victim of child abuse in Telford. Emily, not her real name, prefers not to appear on camera, but these are her words, spoken by an actor.
At college, I met Andrea, who was a little bit older, and she introduced me to local Pakistani men who worked in the kebab house in my town in South Wales. We would just go to the kebab house where we'd receive free food, free drink, free cigarettes, free alcohol. It was all just a treat for us, which we loved as young girls. When I was still 14, Andrea took me to the promenade in the town where we met the Pakistani kebab house workers, and then 5 or 6 of them gang raped me. I knew 3 of them from the kebab house, but the others I'd never met before. There were 3 kebab houses in the town, and they all knew each other, and they linked up when they raped me. They were all linked. We were trafficked to Telford, Hereford and Blackpool. I was 14 and 15 during this period when I was raped and trafficked regularly. My mum was so happy that I'd found friends, but she had no idea what was going on.
Just as I'd found in Rotherham and Rochdale, the gangs of abusers used the boyfriend model of exploitation to lure in their victims.
While my abusers threatened, raped and violated me, they were also kind, but it would change. They called us gory girls, white. When I eventually got my police records back, there are 200 to 300 pages about how I'd been strangled, threatened with a knife, someone was sent to petrol bomb my house, I was raped over 1,000 times, and I don't even know how many men assaulted me. It was just a thing that happened to us, and it might sound crazy, but it was just normal. It felt normal. It's all we knew.
Emily's suffering represents one story in a much wider pattern of abuse. This crisis was not isolated to a few towns. It had swept the country. Reports from Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford were joined by stories from dozens of other towns and cities. This national scandal required a national response.